a quiet town cast in Shadow's Coldwater, Alabama. Nestled in the heart of the American South, the town was like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Brick storefronts lined the downtown streets, and white picket fences framed homes draped in the cool shade of oak trees. It was a place where neighbors greeted one another by name, where church bells rang out on Sunday mornings, and where crime was little more than tales whispered about distant cities seen on the evening news. But on a brisk October morning in 1985, that illusion of small-town serenity was shattered. It began with a worker's casual discovery amid the skeletal remnants of an abandoned industrial park on the town's outskirts. The factory had once been a place of pride in Coldwater, providing jobs that sustained countless families. Now it was a husk, left to rust beneath tangled vines and creeping weeds. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, eerie shadows across the dilapidated structure, when the worker spotted something awful. He stumbled upon the lifeless body of a woman, half hidden among the debris, her pale arm outstretched as if reaching for salvation. The scene was brutal, almost theatrical in its horror. Police arrived quickly, led by Sheriff Roy McCain, a seasoned lawman with 20 years on the force who had never seen anything like this. The woman, identified later as 26-year-old Sarah Blythe, a waitress at the local diner, was positioned unnaturally, posed deliberately. Her body bore no immediate signs of trauma that would betray her final moments, but there was something haunting about the vacant stare in her eyes, as if she had seen her killer and silently begged for mercy. "This doesn't happen here," McCain murmured, his voice cracked with unease as he surveyed the gruesome scene. The young deputies beside him fidgeted nervously, unused to more than barroom brawls or the occasional petty theft. But it was more than the woman's death that unnerved McCain. It was the air itself. There was a stillness, a heaviness that clung to the site like the ruins of the factory had somehow absorbed the despair of what had happened there. After the body was removed and initial evidence collected, a single question reverberated through Coldwater. Who could have done this? Sarah Blythe wasn't just a name in a police report, she was part of the town's fabric. She was the bright smile delivering coffee at the diner, the friendly face at church socials. Her murder wasn't just a violent act, it was a wound that tore into the soul of the community. For weeks, Coldwater's once cordial streets turned into places of whispers. At the local barber shop, in the pews of the First Baptist Church over family dinners, people speculated and theorized about the person behind such a heinous crime. The authorities worked tirelessly to find leads, a footprint in the soft dirt, a strand of hair, something, anything, but came up short. Small towns had their fair share of secrets, sure, but this was different. This was the kind of darkness that hung in the air, changing a place in ways no one could understand yet. And then it happened again. 6 months later, in the early hours of a foggy April morning, another body was found. This time the remains of a teenage girl just 17 years old, lying limp beside the Coldwater Creek Bridge. Even more disturbing than the murder itself was the calculated way the crime mirrored Sarah Blythe's death. The eerie posing of the body, the meticulousness of it all, left no doubt. Someone was hunting in Coldwater, and they had done it again. By summer, parents wouldn't let their children out after dark, and locks were sold out at the local hardware store. An unspoken shift had seized the town. The warmth of neighborly trust was replaced by the coldness of suspicion. That lingering southern hospitality, it disappeared behind drawn curtains and locked doors. "You know, Sheriff," a reporter from the Coldwater Gazette asked McCain, "people used to brag about how safe this town was. Now it's as if the place is cloaked in dread." The sheriff didn't answer. What could he say? He felt it too, the oppressive weight that seemed to settle over the town every day that the monster responsible for these murders roamed free. His force wasn't prepared for it, not really. Coldwater didn't have homicide detectives or high-tech labs. It had McCain, a handful of deputies, and the slim hope that the killer would slip up. But the killer didn't slip up. As the months turned into years and more bodies turned up, it became clear that they weren't dealing with a typical criminal. This was someone deliberate, calculated, someone who reveled in tormenting not just his victims but the entire town. Every time a new body was discovered, it felt like a reminder, I'm still here, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. The first murder and the killer's method. It was a crisp autumn morning in October 1985 when the quiet town of Coldwater woke to news it would never forget. The discovery was made just after dawn by a maintenance worker named Joe Barrett, who had walked the same route hundreds of times without incident. That morning, he was on his way to inspect one of the crumbling warehouses on the industrial outskirts of town. The area itself was a relic of better times. Coldwater's now abandoned industrial park had once been a bustling hub of manufacturing and jobs. But over the years, the factories had shuttered, the workers had moved away, and the place became overgrown with weeds, forgotten by everyone except for the occasional wanderer. Joe wasn't expecting to find much that day besides graffiti and rusted machinery, but as he rounded the corner of a building, his stomach turned, and his heart shot to his throat. There, lying partially hidden among the debris, was a woman's body. Her lifeless form seemed out of place among the discarded metal and broken glass, like a macabre piece of modern art. Joe stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a pile of wooden pallets as he pulled himself together and ran to call the police. When the authorities arrived, led by Sheriff Roy McCain, the gravity of the situation became immediately apparent. The victim was a young woman, later identified as Sarah Blythe, a 26-year-old waitress at the local diner. She was the kind of person everyone knew in a town like Coldwater, the one who remembered how you took your coffee and always had a kind word. Now she was lying dead, her body positioned unnaturally, almost as though it had been arranged. The scene was chillingly meticulous. There was no blood, no visible signs of a struggle. Sarah's pale skin gleamed under the faint morning light, her arms stretched out as though she had been reaching for something, or perhaps someone, for help. Sheriff McCain, in his 20 years of service, had seen his fair share of death, but never anything like this. The medical examiner's initial report provided little clarity. The cause of death was strangulation, the ligature marks faint but unmistakable around her neck. However, there were no cuts or bruises that might indicate a violent struggle. It was as if the victim had been subdued without resistance. Even more unsettling was the lack of any forensic evidence at the scene. No fingerprints, no discarded items, nothing to suggest who could possibly be responsible for leaving Sarah Blythe here like a discarded marionette. "This doesn't add up," McCain muttered, adjusting his hat as he surveyed the warehouse. The dust on the ground was undisturbed, and there were no clear signs of how Sarah's body got there. McCain pointed out to his deputies that there were no drag marks or footprints leading to where her body had been found, which led him to a chilling conclusion. The murder didn't happen here. Whoever had killed Sarah had brought her here specifically to leave her body, taking great care to stage the scene. It was deliberate, calculated. It meant something. "This ain't no wandering drifter or crime of passion," McCain said to his deputy Andy Malone as he lit a cigarette and stared into the distance. "Whoever did this planned it." While the crime scene was being scoured for clues, investigators scrambled to piece together Sarah's final hours. Interviews with friends and co-workers painted a picture of an ordinary Wednesday evening. She'd wrapped up her shift at the diner just past 9 p.m. and mentioned wanting to get home early. According to her roommate, she never made it back. "She wasn't seeing anyone, at least not that I know of," Judy Ellen, Sarah's co-worker, told police. "She wasn't the type to take risks. She kept to herself. If someone did this, she must have known them. Sarah wouldn't get into a car with a stranger." The search for answers became more desperate as the days wore on. The lack of evidence was frustrating, almost maddening. The medical examiner noted something else odd. There was no sign of struggle, either on Sarah's body or in the form of defensive wounds. There were also faint impressions on her wrists, consistent with being bound at some point, though no restraints were left behind. The killer, whoever they were, had taken great care to cover their tracks. "This guy's careful," McCain admitted at a press conference, his voice tinged with a mix of frustration and concern. "He's not sloppy, and that's what scares me." Speculation ran wild among the townsfolk. Some theorized it was an outsider, someone passing through who took a sick pleasure in tormenting small communities. Others believed it had to be someone local. Who else could have known how to avoid being seen, they wondered aloud over coffee at the diner where Sarah had once worked. The killer's precision was both terrifying and maddening. Without a single piece of evidence to go on, the investigation hit a dead end. But this wasn't the end of the nightmare for Coldwater. Far from it. This was only the beginning. Forensic experts and criminal psychologists brought in from Birmingham began analyzing the mind of the killer. The positioning of Sarah's body, the care with which her lifeless form was arranged, was what they called staging. It wasn't enough for the murderer to kill. They wanted the police or perhaps the public to see their work. This detail sent a chill through McCain. To stage a scene like this wasn't just cold and methodical, it was an act of dominance. A way for the killer to say, Look at what I've done and you can't catch me." Weeks turned into months, and despite intensive effort, no leads emerged. The case of Sarah Blythe's murder became something of a local ghost story, a tale whispered during cold nights or among the regulars at the diner. For Sheriff McCain and his team, it was more than unfinished business. It was a failure, a reminder that evil had come to their town and walked away without a trace. And while most assumed Sarah's murder was a tragic, isolated incident, McCain couldn't shake the feeling that the killer wasn't finished. He was right. 6 months later, another body would be found, and the nightmare would begin anew. The killer strikes again, a string of grisly murders. By early 1986, Coldwater had started to settle back into a tentative state of normalcy. The tragic murder of Sarah Blythe lingered like a haunting memory, but as time passed and no new crimes were reported, the townsfolk began to convince themselves that perhaps the nightmare was over. Maybe, they thought, it was some passing lunatic who had moved on, far from their little corner of the South. Sheriff Roy McCain, however, never believed it for a second. Then, on a cold February morning, that fragile illusion was shattered once more. This time, a hunter walking his usual trail just outside Stokes Woods stumbled upon something that turned his stomach. The underbrush was sparse that time of year, the frost giving the ground an icy sheen, but it was hard to miss the pale, lifeless body of a second victim lying amidst the brush. Her hair was matted with dirt, her hands folded unnaturally across her chest. Like Sarah Blythe, she had been carefully posed, as though her killer had deliberately created a tableau for the world to see. When Sheriff McCain arrived on the scene, that all-too-familiar heaviness settled over him again. This wasn't a coincidence. He knew it as sure as he knew his own name. Coldwater's storm wasn't passing, it was only beginning. "It's her all over again," Deputy Andy Malone murmured as he stood over the body. The young deputy kept shifting nervously, trying to avoid meeting the empty stare of the victim. McCain pursed his lips tight and crouched down, his hand on his knees. He studied the scene intently, looking for anything, a stray hair, a footprint in the mud, something the perpetrator may have overlooked. "Nah, Andy, it's not her," the sheriff said finally, standing up. "But it's him, all right. This sick son of a bitch is back." The victim, later identified as 21-year-old Heather Campbell, bore chilling similarities to Sarah Blythe in how she had died. Strangulation was once again the cause of death, with faint ligature marks around her neck. Like Sarah, Heather had no visible defensive wounds, suggesting she was either subdued psychologically or physically before she died. However, some details grew even more disturbing the longer the investigation went on. Unlike Sarah, Heather's wrists showed clearer indications that she had been bound for an extended period. This detail sent a chill through McCain. "This guy's evolving," the sheriff muttered to himself back at the precinct. "He's got more time, more reason, more control." The killer's second strike reignited Coldwater's fear, but by April, just as the town began bracing for the worst, he struck once again, this time with a distinctly darker tone in his method. The third known victim, a teenage girl who had just celebrated her 18th birthday, was discovered near Coldwater Creek's historic bridge during one of the foggiest mornings of the year. According to the jogger who found her, her face seemed almost serene, a stark contrast to the heinous reality of what had been done to her. Kerchiefs and cloths tied her hands and feet tightly together. The medical examiner would later confirm that she was likely kept alive for hours, possibly even a day, before being strangled and abandoned like some kind of cruel afterthought. "He's taking his time," McCain grumbled to the deputies during the post-mortem briefing at the station. His frustration came out in sharp bursts. "He's got a goddamn playbook now." By now, each of these murders wasn't just a tragedy for the individual victims and their families, they were acts of terror for the entire town. Parents started pulling their kids from after-school events, making curfews stricter. Women no longer jogged alone at dawn or dusk. The streets, once full of southern charm and life, grew quieter as Coldwater succumbed to paralysis by fear. Church pews were packed on Sundays with prayers for safety rising to the heavens, but no one seemed to know how to make it stop. Community trust also began eroding. With no suspects and no signs indicating that the killer was an outsider, neighbors started looking upon each other with suspicion. Was it the shy guy down the street who rarely left his house? Or that friendly store clerk who always kept just a little too much eye contact? Whispered accusations flew left and right, but none led to answers. And with every sunset, the dread returned. It was like the town had stopped breathing. Sheriff McCain felt the noose tightening. The press dubbed him the Stokes Shadow, after the location of Heather's body, though McCain refused to repeat any nickname that might give the killer a sense of infamy. Newspapers from Birmingham to Atlanta picked up the story. It seemed that for the first time the outside world heard Coldwater's name, not for its southern charms or its picturesque views, but for the terror lurking in its shadows. "It's what he wants," McCain said bitterly to a local reporter. "He wants you. Hell, he wants us to talk about him, to glorify him, get his name on your front page. Well, not on my watch, not happening." But it wasn't enough to keep the killer out of the spotlight. He filled that spotlight with darkness at every opportunity. Over the next 6 months, 2 more bodies were found, both women, both local. One was a 29-year-old real estate agent, abducted as she walked from her office parking lot. The other, a store clerk who was supposed to lock up that night but never got the chance. Each crime scene became increasingly detailed, increasingly deliberate. The lack of evidence only grew more frustrating because despite his growing audacity, the killer left no solid leads. "It's like chasing a ghost, Sheriff," Deputy Malone remarked during one particularly bleak day at the station. "He's everywhere and nowhere all at once." "Not a ghost," McCain snapped, pointing an accusing finger at the map of Coldwater on the wall, where pins showed the locations of each victim's discovery. "That bastard's flesh and blood, Andy. We just have to figure out where he hides in the daylight." By the start of 1987, McCain and his deputies had exhausted every lead, every hunch, every hope of finding a breakthrough. Although advancements like forensic hair analysis were being used in metropolitan areas, Coldwater felt like it was years behind. With each passing week, more people wondered aloud, was this something Coldwater's small police force would ever be equipped to handle? But even as fear began to entangle the community, McCain refused to call in federal support. It wasn't pride, not exactly. He knew that once the Bureau or major state agencies got involved, little towns like Coldwater were brushed aside as footnotes. He couldn't allow that, and yet there was no denying it anymore. There was someone walking around Coldwater, going about his days like any other citizen, while turning his nights into nightmares for the unlucky women he targeted. If there was one thing clear, it was this: he wasn't finished yet. And if history up to this point was any indicator, his next move would be just around the corner. Beneath the crumbling masks. By late 1987, the weight of the murders hung over Coldwater like a heavy storm cloud that refused to break. Life in the quaint Alabama town had become a parody of itself, a chilling inversion of everything it used to be. Gone were the easy smiles exchanged at church or over grocery aisles. Gone were late-night strolls, unlocked doors, and the casual trust that once defined the close-knit community. Instead, people walked with their heads down, their minds filled with whispered suspicions about who could be hiding behind a friendly facade. Beneath the surface of Coldwater's once idyllic streets was a new undercurrent, a simmering war of fear and paranoia. Every corner was now a question, every neighbor a potential answer to the unthinkable question: who is he? Sheriff Roy McCain sat in his office one December evening, staring at the contents of what was now being called the Shadow Case, an ever-expanding heap of trouble spread out across his desk in the form of crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and interview transcripts. The uneasiness that had become his constant companion gnawed at him like a dull ache. One thing McCain knew for certain: the killer clearly wasn't operating on impulse. Every detail on every victim, from their neat yet haunting poses to the absence of meaningful forensic evidence, pointed to someone who was meticulous, patient, and disturbingly deliberate. This wasn't just about murder. This was someone sending a message. "Look at them, they hate each other now," he muttered under his breath as he glanced out of the station window. The sight of the once charming community, now stitched together by fraying threads of suspicion, unsettled him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The town's grocery clerks eyed customers suspiciously, Sunday school teachers whispered about their single neighbors, and parents no longer let their children ride their bikes alone. Long-time friendships strained under the invisible pressure of unspoken accusations. Coldwater wasn't just a town anymore, it was a psychological minefield. The killer had shown no signs of slowing down. Since the first murder of Sarah Blythe in 1985, and with each subsequent discovery, Sheriff McCain had learned that Coldwater's silent monster had a disturbingly unique modus operandi. The patterns, if you could call them that, were subtle but undeniable. Each victim seemed carefully chosen. Women aged 18, 35, attractive in different ways but sharing some hard-to-place commonality. Yet they didn't all know one another, nor were they from the same neighborhoods. A waitress, a college student, a single mother of one. Even after months of interviews and re-interviews, trying to find something, anything that tied these women together, Coldwater PD had come up empty. The only thread McCain could cling to was the one that stretched across the killer's methods. He wasn't just snuffing out lives, he was orchestrating atrocities. Each murder was deeply personal and profoundly theatrical. The victims were often found in remote but symbolically conspicuous locations. Abandoned lots, barren woods, empty bridges that once pulsed with life but were now rotting relics of a bygone era. Locations that seemed chosen. Each crime scene was disturbingly void of chaos. The ligature marks on the neck, consistent, as if whoever did this had learned the exact amount of pressure needed to kill without signs of a prolonged struggle. And yet, despite being methodical, the killer left behind no traceable evidence. No hairs, fibers, or fingerprints. Not a single damn thing. Control, FBI profiler Don Mathis had told McCain during a sit-down at the precinct earlier that fall. The department had reluctantly reached out to Birmingham for outside help after victim number 4. Mathis, tall and stern with sharp analytical eyes, hadn't minced his words. "This guy's all about control, Sheriff. He doesn't kill because he has to, he kills because he wants to, and because he likes it," Mathis had said, pointing to the crime scene photos. Sheriff McCain nodded grimly as Mathis continued. "Look at the staging. He kills them where they can't fight, moves their bodies, and places them like this," Mathis emphasized by tapping on an image of one of the victims, her pale arms crossed over her chest. "This isn't random, it's not sloppy, it's almost reverent." "Reverent?" McCain said with a raised brow, taken aback by the term. "Yes," Mathis sat forward. "Think of it as art. He doesn't just kill them, he positions them afterward, makes them visible. He wants to force people, your town, to see this, to feel helpless, scared. It's power, Sheriff. This is how he exerts his control over them, over you." McCain let the profiler's words settle in the room like smoke. It made him sick to his stomach because he knew it was true. The bastard wasn't just a killer, he was a puppeteer, pulling strings and forcing Coldwater to dance. The worst part of it all was the lack of meaningful leads. In 3 years the killer hadn't made a single mistake, no witnesses, no direct sightings, no sloppiness. It was as though he slipped into Coldwater's streets in complete silence and left just as quietly. All the department had to cling to were faint patterns, the general time frame of the killings, late evenings, the staging and the unparalleled care taken to avoid leaving evidence behind. But McCain had learned one thing, something Mathis had reiterated before flying back to Birmingham. Killers like this, Sheriff, they eventually get sloppier. They don't stop unless they get caught or die, but the more they kill, the more chances there are that they get cocky, or desperate. Desperation. To McCain's growing frustration, it wasn't the murderer who seemed desperate, it was his own department. Small-town Coldwater wasn't built for this kind of sustained chaos. They didn't have forensic labs, criminal psychologists, or even the manpower to monitor suspicious individuals around the clock. Hell, his deputies barely had enough training to deal with something beyond stolen bicycles or Saturday night bar fights. And yet, despite feeling like the world was closing in on him, McCain wasn't about to call in federal help again so soon. If Mathis had been right, and McCain prayed to God he was, the killer couldn't keep up his flawless act forever. He would slip. Somewhere, somehow the mask he'd spent years perfecting would crack, and McCain vowed to be there when it did. Until that moment came, Coldwater continued to decay. The killer hadn't just murdered 5 women, he was killing the town, slowly carving away its trust and sense of safety. Neighbors waved less. Strangers received longer stares. Husbands checked the locks one more time before bed. Beneath Coldwater's polite smiles, the darkness festered. If nothing else though, McCain knew one truth. You can only hide beneath a mask for so long before the face beneath begins to rot. And when it finally fell apart, McCain would be waiting. Chasing shadows. Following the killer's trail. By the summer of 1988, frustration had become a constant companion for Sheriff Roy McCain and his deputies. Coldwater had endured 3 long years of fear and uncertainty, and the only steady truth was this: the killer was still out there. Each new murder unearthed nothing but more questions. The town had gone from a warm, tight-knit community to a breeding ground for suspicion and paranoia. To the weary eyes of its citizens, everyone was a suspect, and yet, the killer was no phantom. Roy McCain reminded himself of that each time he stared at the caseboard in his office, covered in photographs of victims, locations, and maps littered with pushpins. Somewhere, someone had seen him. Somewhere, the smallest piece of the puzzle was waiting to be found. McCain just had to find it before another life was taken. It's a manhunt, Deputy Andy Malone muttered one afternoon, running a hand through his short-cut hair. Except we don't even know who the hell we're looking for. Manhunt! More like chasing fog, McCain snapped, his voice edged with the frustration of sleepless nights. He pushed back from his desk, lit a cigarette, and stared out the precinct window. This guy, he's clever, he doesn't leave mistakes. Whoever he is, he knows these streets better than we do. The break they needed came from the unlikeliest of places. The ground. One grim morning in August, McCain received a call to come out to the site of the latest murder, a wooded stretch just beyond the municipal dump. A sanitation worker had been the one to find the body of a young store clerk who'd vanished 2 days earlier. The scene was similar to the others, her body posed in that chillingly calculated way, her face a portrait of both innocence and death. But this time there was something new, something that shouldn't have been there. McCain crouched down beside the victim and stared at the soft ground a few feet away. A faint indentation marred the otherwise smooth dirt. Tire tracks. The kind that might not catch your eye unless you were looking for them. "Andy!" McCain called out, gesturing towards the trail that led into the woods. "Get someone from the county out here to cast this. I want impressions. Measurements." Deputy Malone nodded, scribbling the note quickly into his field notebook before gesturing toward the ground. "You think it's from him? Maybe the son of a bitch finally screwed up." McCain squinted at the tracks, tilting his hat back on his head. "It's from him. Count on it." The forensic team arrived that afternoon, casting the tire impression and running it through their limited resources. Within 2 days, the results landed in McCain's hands. The tracks matched the tires of a vehicle commonly seen in the region, an older model Ford Econoline van, a bulky utilitarian vehicle often used for deliveries or maintenance work, something that, in McCain's mind, fit the profile. A man who could move unnoticed, operating just enough under the radar to avoid attention. "All right, it's a start," McCain said during a briefing with his team. The small room where they gathered, a makeshift war room filled with case files and photographs, hummed with tension. "What I want from you all is simple. Find these vans, every last one of them. Anyone in town who owns or drives something that even looks like this, talk to them." "We're talking hundreds of drives," Malone piped up, leaning against the map pinned to the wall. "Then we better get moving," McCain shot back. The next few weeks were a blur of late nights and door-to-door interviews. Coldwater was no stranger to pickup trucks or small sedans. Vans, on the other hand, stood out. McCain and his deputies narrowed their search to just over 120 registered vehicles in the area, matching the van's description. The problem arose quickly. Neither the tracks nor the records gave them a definitive connection to a suspect. Of the van owners interviewed, most had clear alibis for the nights in question. Others were elderly or otherwise deemed unlikely, but McCain didn't believe in eliminating anyone until absolutely necessary. "I've knocked on more damn doors in the last 2 weeks than I have in my whole career," Andy Malone grumbled one night after a long shift. He loosened his tie while slumping into the chair across from McCain. Files and cigarette butts littered the sheriff's desk. "You're young," McCain replied flatly, not looking up from the report he was reviewing. "When I was your age, I did a lot of door knocking. Now we call it police work." Malone chuckled dryly. "But what if we're wrong, Roy? What if this guy's driving something else entirely?" "No," McCain said immediately, the conviction in his voice stronger than ever. He tapped his cigarette against an ashtray. "The track ties to the scene. He's got wheels now. You give this monster the ability to cover ground like that and he'll get bolder. We don't stop until we're sure." Meanwhile, the profiler's assessment of the killer sharpened their focus. The man they were looking for wasn't just someone impulsive or reckless. He was methodical, possibly living a quiet, unnoticed life somewhere within their very community. The waffle pattern on the tire added a chilling new thought. This wasn't someone passing through. This was someone planted in Coldwater's soil. McCain spent hours poring over grids and lists, piecing together the relationships between the murky edges of the investigation. A few names caught his eye. Several van owners who claimed they were out of town during some of the murders. One name in particular, George H. Walker, lingered in the back of his mind for reasons he couldn't quite put a finger on. "Walker," McCain muttered to himself late one night, crossing the name with other reports. George Walker had a checkered record. Nothing serious, just trespassing or the occasional DUI. But McCain knew better than to dismiss eccentricities. Sometimes the quietest knock was the one worth answering, and yet each lead seemed to halt just short of something tangible. McCain knew that every day the killer evaded them was another day someone else's life was in danger. The van tracks had given them a thread, but it was thin, stretching out into uncertainty. McCain leaned back in his chair one late evening, the dim light of his office casting long shadows along the walls. His hat sat on the edge of his desk, untouched for hours. Outside, the town slept in apprehensive silence, its people tucked safely, or so they thought, within their homes. One thing McCain couldn't shake was this: the killer was always just one step ahead. "That bastard made a mistake once," McCain muttered, the resolve hardening in his voice. "He'll make another, and when he does, we'll be there." The tire tracks were a glimmer of hope, a trail through the darkness. But it wasn't enough to bring an end to the nightmare, not yet. For now, the hunt continued. The killer's profile begins to take shape. By the time 1989 rolled around, the people of Coldwater had been living in terror for nearly 4 years. The killer continued to strike, leaving behind his chillingly staged crime scenes but no viable clues to work with. He seemed invisible, as though he existed only in the dark spaces between Coldwater's quiet streets and shadowed woods. With each passing month his crimes grew more calculated, his staging more deliberate and haunting. And still there wasn't even a whisper of a name, a face, or a motive. Sheriff Roy McCain spent sleepless nights with the case files sprawled out across his desk, like pieces of a maddening puzzle, but no matter how much he stared, the picture never fully materialized. It was as if the killer had somehow managed to erase his own presence from existence. But McCain knew better. "No one's a ghost," he grumbled to himself during one of those long, lonely nights at the precinct. "This guy's human, which means he's got habits, routines, and somewhere, somehow, there's a crack in his act." It was around this time that outside help came knocking again. The Birmingham field office of the FBI, which had been loosely monitoring the case since the beginning, decided it was time to officially intervene. McCain, though hesitant, agreed to a meeting with FBI profiler Don Mathis, a straight-talking, no-nonsense type known for crafting eerily accurate psychological profiles of violent criminals. Control, cooling off, and the mask. Their first meeting was tense, McCain's small-town pride rubbing uncomfortably against Mathis's big-city authority. But as Mathis spoke, outlining the profile he'd been building based on the killer's methods, McCain couldn't help but feel like he was finally staring into the shadow of the man who had terrorized Coldwater for so long. "This isn't your average serial killer," Mathis began, pacing the room with a calm yet commanding presence. He gestured toward the photographs pinned to McCain's wall, the victims, the locations, the eerily perfect symmetry of it all. "You're not looking for some desperate drifter or a guy with a collection of mugshots. This killer, he's deliberate, calculated. He'd rather remain invisible than make a splash. That kind of discipline, it means we're dealing with someone smart, someone who plans." McCain lit a cigarette, blowing the smoke toward the ceiling. "Smart, huh? Great. So we're hunting a genius?" Mathis smirked but didn't laugh. "Not necessarily smart in the way you're thinking. He may not be book smart or educated, but he's methodical. He's the type of guy who lives a quiet life on the surface. Probably works a job that allows him to blend in, something solitary where no one bothers to notice if he comes and goes at odd hours. Warehouse work, delivery driving, maintenance, something like that." McCain raised an eyebrow. "You really think he's sitting around playing Mr. Ordinary? What makes you sure?" Mathis pointed at a diagram he had drawn on the whiteboard, a chronological breakdown of the killings. "It's all about routine, no impulse. These murders? They're like clockwork, planned, staggered, deliberately spaced apart. You see this gap between victim 2 and 3, 4 months, then 6 between the next. That's his cooling off period. That's when he goes back to pretending to be normal. No one notices him because he's carefully constructed this—" Mathis paused, searching for the word. "Mask." "Mask?" McCain repeated, leaning forward. "Yes, Sheriff," Mathis continued. "The mask of a quiet, unremarkable man. Think about it. In a town like Coldwater, how many men come to mind who float below the radar? Single, middle-aged, just a little odd but not suspicious? They might show up to church once a month or make polite chit-chat at the hardware store, but nothing about them sticks. That's how he hides. Ordinary is the perfect disguise." McCain exhaled slowly, thinking about the countless interviews he'd conducted over the years. He thought about the faces in his files, van drivers, retail workers, warehouse men who had waved him off or answered his questions with awkward smiles, just eager to close the door. There were so many faces. Too many. A man of habit. Mathis didn't stop there. "Another thing we know about him, he's obsessed with control. Look at his victims, the staging, the strangulation. It all points to someone who needs to dominate, to strip them of any potential resistance. This isn't someone who lashes out in a rage. These killings are rituals. each one representing his need to feel powerful. You'll find that these guys often come from backgrounds where they lacked control. Maybe he grew up in an abusive home, maybe he was bullied as a child. Somewhere early on he learned what it feels like to be powerless, and now he's making sure everyone else feels what he once did. McCain stared at the board, captivated but furious. "You're telling me we're dealing with some broken little boy who grew up into a monster?" Mathis met his gaze evenly. "I'm telling you that monsters come from somewhere. Understanding that, that's how we catch them." Building the composite, the invisible man. As the weeks turned into months, McCain's department began piecing together the fragments of Mathis's profile. The killer, they learned, was likely a single man between his early 30s and mid-40s. He probably lived alone in a modest house or apartment, with no close relationships and family either estranged or absent entirely. He was a man comfortable with solitude, someone who didn't rely on social situations to validate his existence. He may have had a history of petty crimes, trespassing, disorderly conduct, or even DUIs, but nothing that would have drawn long-term attention from law enforcement. The absence of a major criminal record fit his profile perfectly. He likely spent years learning how to operate under the radar, perfecting the silent art of invisibility. Then there were his habits. The man McCain was chasing wasn't reckless. Every murder had been meticulously planned, from the locations where the bodies were found to the absolute lack of physical evidence left behind. This was a man who covered his tracks, who rehearsed every action in his head like a play before stepping onto the stage. So, where does that leave us? McCain sat back in his chair one late evening, his hat on the desk in front of him, and his eyes fixed on the notes sprawled across the table. His deputy, Andy Malone, shifted nearby, nursing the bitter dregs of his coffee. "It leaves us looking for a ghost in plain sight," McCain finally said, frustration leaking into his voice. "Some guy we've probably walked past a dozen times without giving a second thought." Malone sipped his coffee and frowned. "How do you spot someone who's trying to be invisible?" McCain leaned forward, determination flashing in his tired eyes. "You stop thinking about who he is and start looking for what he is. A guy like this can only fake normal for so long before his cracks start to show. Someone out there has seen it. We just have to find them." Although Mathis's profile gave McCain and his team new direction, they knew one thing for certain: time was running out. The killer, whoever he was, would not stop. And with each passing day, the clock ticked closer to his next chilling masterpiece. The turning point: deciding to use DNA analysis. By 1989, the frustration within the Coldwater Police Department had reached a boiling point. 4 years had passed since Sarah Blythe's body was discovered, and the killer had since claimed more victims in his haunting spree. Sheriff Roy McCain, once confident that his small but determined team could put an end to the town's nightmare, was beginning to feel the crushing pressure of failure. He had tried everything: interviews, canvassing, working with criminal profilers, hunting down every whisper of a lead. Yet the killer remained an invisible phantom, slipping through their grasp at every turn. But the truth was simple, and it gnawed at McCain in the quiet hours of the night. This killer wasn't invincible. He was just careful. Too careful. And that precision, that meticulous planning, was exactly why they hadn't been able to catch him. They couldn't outthink him, and McCain knew they couldn't wait for him to make a mistake. Something had to change. It was time to adapt. That's when the idea of DNA analysis came up, a decision that would become a pivotal moment not just in the case, but in Coldwater's history. An unfamiliar frontier. At the time, DNA analysis was still a relatively new tool in American law enforcement. Developed in the mid-1980s, it had successfully helped solve a few high-profile cases, but the technology was costly, time-consuming, and far from widely used. In a small town like Coldwater, with a police department that barely scraped by on an already tight budget, DNA testing felt like a pipe dream. "Sheriff, with all due respect," Deputy Andy Malone said during a heated discussion in the station's war room, "we don't even have the equipment. Hell, the closest crime lab with DNA capabilities is down in Birmingham, and they're not exactly handing out free tests. We're talking weeks, maybe months before we get results. That's if they even let us do it." McCain sat at the center of the table, his fingers steepled as he listened. His jaw tightened, a sign he'd heard enough. "We're 4 years into this circus," he finally said, his voice sharp and unwavering. 4 damn years. I don't care if I have to beg, borrow, or steal. If this is our next move, we're making it." "But what if it doesn't work?" Malone pressed, his frustration bubbling over. "It's a long shot at best. You're betting the farm on something that might not even give us a lead." McCain stood, planting both hands firmly on the table. "And what the hell's the alternative, Andy?" His voice filled the room with the kind of authority that silenced any rebuttal. "Wait for this son of a bitch to dump another body in my jurisdiction? Turn this whole town into a goddamn ghost town? I'm done waiting. I'm done playing defense." Malone leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. He knew McCain had a point. The badge weighed heavily on all of them, but no one felt it like the sheriff. For every murder the killer got away with, the people of Coldwater lost a little more faith, a little more trust. Another part of their town died. It wasn't just about catching the killer anymore. It was about saving what was left of Coldwater before it was too late. A faint glimmer of hope. The decision to pursue DNA analysis wasn't made lightly. The town's murders hadn't exactly been rich with forensic evidence. The killer had been meticulous, a ghost who left no fingerprints or other obvious clues. But there was one sliver of hope, trace evidence found on the victims' bodies, hair fibers, skin cells, maybe even saliva. The killer couldn't erase everything, no matter how careful he was. McCain and his team painstakingly revisited every piece of evidence from the earlier murder cases, scouring for something they might have overlooked. They sent off items, scraps of clothing, fingernail scrapings, and hair samples, to the state's crime lab in Birmingham, praying they would find something that would make the endless hours of searching worth it. The waiting was torture. DNA analysis in those days wasn't instant or convenient. It took weeks, sometimes months, for results to return, especially when labs were overwhelmed with requests from across the state. McCain spent those weeks as he always had, pacing between leads, overseeing interviews, and trying not to let his growing doubts get the better of him. What if this didn't work? What if they were at a dead end after this? The call that changed everything. Then, on a gray Thursday near the end of March, McCain's office phone rang. On the other end of the line was a technician from the Birmingham crime lab. The news wasn't earth-shattering, but it was enough to reignite the spark of hope Coldwater desperately needed. "We've got something," the technician said. "The DNA samples you sent us, some of them are degraded, but there's a partial profile in the mix. It's not much, but it's something." McCain gripped the receiver tightly, his heart pounding. A partial DNA profile. It wasn't a name or a face, but it was the first tangible lead they'd had in years. "What about the national database?" he asked, his voice steady but strained. "Anything match?" "Not yet," the technician replied. "CODIS is still in its early days. If your suspect's not already in the system, we won't get a hit. But if he ever gets arrested, we'll know." It wasn't the definitive answer McCain had hoped for, but it was enough to solidify his decision to keep moving forward with this new technology. He called his deputies into the station and went over the news. "Here's what we know now," he said, pointing to the board where photos of the victims hung like a morbid gallery. "The bastard who did this has left at least part of himself behind. We might not know who he is yet, but he's made a mistake, and it's on record. This isn't over." Tension in the town news of the DNA breakthrough spread, stoking a mixture of hope and anxiety in the community. For the first time, people believed the killer might finally be caught, but there was still uncertainty. Coldwater wasn't used to waiting, and every week that passed without an arrest felt like another chance for the killer to strike again. For McCain, the challenge wasn't just about solving the case anymore. It was about managing expectations. He knew DNA was a tool, not a miracle. "It's not a quick fix," he told a reporter at the Coldwater Gazette when pressed for a timeline. "But it's a step in the right direction. We know more today than we did yesterday, and that's how we're going to win this thing." A new weapon in the fight. The decision to use DNA was a turning point for the case, and for law enforcement in Coldwater. For the first time, the killer wasn't just an idea on the wind, he was flesh and blood, tethered to reality by a traceable signature. The process wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And McCain knew one thing for certain: time was no longer entirely on the killer's side. "Men like him think they can outlast us," McCain muttered late one night, staring at the lab's initial report. "But they forget one thing: patience doesn't make you invincible." The killer had made a mistake. It was only a matter of time before McCain and his team found a way to turn that mistake into justice. The killer's fatal mistake. By July of 1990, the killer's reign of terror had persisted for nearly 5 years. Coldwater, once defined by its white picket fences and friendly smiles, had transformed into a community of drawn curtains and locked doors. Through careful planning, an obsessive attention to detail, and what had seemed like sheer luck, the monster in their midst had evaded capture. Women lived in fear, Men looked over their shoulders, and Sheriff Roy McCain wrestled with sleepless nights. But what no one realized, what the killer himself didn't realize, was that his carefully constructed web of control was beginning to tear. In his confidence, and perhaps his arrogance, he was about to make his first and greatest mistake: the vanishing of Emma Carlisle. It started on a humid Friday evening in late July, when Emma Carlisle, a 24-year-old grocery store clerk, failed to return home after her shift. Emma was a friendly, dependable figure in town, the one who knew every customer's name and always offered to carry groceries out for the elderly regulars. It was completely unlike her to disappear without notice, and when she didn't come home that night, her family immediately contacted the police. McCain had seen this before. Missing women always sent a chill down his spine, especially when their profile aligned with the list of victims already pinned to his office map. Young, independent, trusting. Emma fit that mold perfectly, and the sheriff feared the worst. The following morning, her best friend, Kelly Hart, came forward with information that changed everything. "She told me she was meeting up with someone after work," Kelly said, her voice shaky but determined in the station's makeshift war room. Emma didn't say who, but it wasn't a guy or anything romantic. She seemed uneasy about it. McCain leaned forward, his pen poised over his notebook. "Did she say why? Did she give you a name or mention why she was meeting this person?" Kelly shook her head. "No, but she said she thought they were watching her. She said she didn't want to be rude, that it was probably just someone from the store who needed help with something." This was a break, a small one, but the first real lead they'd had in months. The witness's clue. For the first time in the case, there was a witness, someone who may have seen the killer in some capacity. Even if Kelly didn't know who the mystery person was, she had provided a breadcrumb for McCain to follow. Emma must have been lured into trusting the wrong person, someone who preyed on her kindness. The trick was figuring out who. McCain's deputies began canvassing the neighborhood where Emma worked, interviewing co-workers, customers, and anyone who may have seen her after her shift ended. It wasn't until they spoke with an elderly woman who regularly shopped at Emma's grocery store that the next piece of the puzzle fell into place. "She helped me load my groceries into the car that night," the woman explained, holding her handbag tightly as she spoke to Deputy Andy Malone. "I noticed a man in the parking lot. He was leaning against a van just watching her. He didn't say anything, just stared." Malone perked up. "Can you describe him, or the van?" Her brow furrowed. "I didn't get a good look at his face. He kept his head down most of the time, but the van? It was one of those old boxy models, white, maybe beige. It looked dirty, like it hadn't been washed in years. I remember thinking he didn't belong there. He gave me a bad feeling." When Malone relayed the witness statement to McCain, the sheriff's fingers instinctively tightened into a fist. The van, the same elusive vehicle they'd been chasing for nearly 2 years. The mistake in the parking lot. This time, however, the killer hadn't disappeared without a trace. For all of his careful planning, his obsessive rituals, and his years of evading capture, the slip had finally come. He had been seen, not just by his victim, but by a witness. McCain issued an urgent alert across the department: find the van, check employee lots, residential neighborhoods, and industrial parks. Stop every vehicle that even remotely fits the description. The breakthrough came 3 days later when another deputy, Ryan Fletcher, spotted a van matching the description abandoned on the outskirts of town, near a stretch of woods. "It's him," McCain said under his breath as the team approached the vehicle. His heart thudded in his chest when he saw the faded paint. The haze of dirt caked over the windows. Despite the van's long-neglected appearance, the plates were recent, and the vehicle registration traced back to one name: George H. Walker, age 42. George Walker, a quiet ghost in town. Walker had lived in Coldwater for over a decade. He worked a quiet job as a warehouse clerk, kept mostly to himself, and lived alone in a rundown apartment on the edge of town. No one thought twice about him. He wasn't the type to draw attention, and he operated on the fringes of society in a way that fit the profile Mathis had outlined perfectly. Solitary, unassuming, invisible. When McCain and his team brought Walker in for questioning, the man barely blinked. He denied any wrongdoing, calmly claiming he had lent the van to a friend for several days, a friend he conveniently couldn't name. But McCain wasn't buying it. "You've been flying under the radar for years, haven't you, George?" McCain said, leaning across the interrogation table. His voice was low, almost conversational. "You think you're smarter than us, smarter than me, but you made a mistake." Walker remained silent, his blank expression unreadable. McCain continued, his voice gaining weight. That's the thing about mistakes, George. They pile up when you get comfortable, you get sloppy, and that's how we catch you. You're not untouchable, you're just careful. Careful doesn't cut it anymore. The missing pieces clicked together. Even with Walker in custody, McCain knew they needed more. The van itself was processed extensively, but the real breakthrough came when DNA evidence from Walker matched the partial profile detectives had submitted to Birmingham's crime lab months earlier. It was undeniable. George Walker wasn't just a suspect, he was the killer. They found more damning evidence in his apartment, photographs of women he had stalked, small keepsakes belonging to the victims, including jewelry that Emma Carlisle's family immediately recognized. The pieces of Walker's carefully hidden world began to crumble, revealing the full scope of his atrocities. The fatal mistake defined. Walker's mistake wasn't one of impulse, it was one of arrogance. He'd spent years believing he was too meticulous, too invisible to ever be caught. But by lingering a moment too long in the grocery store parking lot, by allowing himself to be seen near Emma Carlisle, he had opened the door just wide enough for McCain and his team to shove it off its hinges. Sick bastard thought he was untouchable, Deputy Malone muttered as they packed up the evidence from Walker's dingy apartment. McCain, standing in the doorway, adjusted his hat and nodded. They all do, until they're not. George Walker's long run of terror was over. The nightmare that had consumed Coldwater was finally nearing its end, but not without leaving scars that would last a lifetime. The case cracks wide open. The news of George Walker's arrest spread across Coldwater faster than wildfire. For 5 long years, the town had been suffocating under the weight of fear, suspicion, and death. Now, at last, there was a face to the terror, a name attached to the shadow that had loomed over them. But for Sheriff Roy McCain, the arrest was only the beginning. The case wasn't sealed, not yet. Walker might have made a mistake, but McCain knew the hardest part was still ahead, proving without a doubt that this quiet, unassuming man was the monster they'd been hunting for so long. Breaking through the mask. The morning after Walker's arrest, McCain sat in the interrogation room with him. The man was calm, eerily so, sitting upright in his chair with his hands folded neatly in front of him. His expression was blank, almost bored, as if he were waiting for an inconvenient flight delay. But McCain wasn't there to entertain him. The sheriff had been up all night reviewing every piece of evidence they had on Walker, the DNA match, the items found in his dingy apartment, the witness statements. Still, McCain's gut told him this case wasn't going to be an open and shut affair. Walker had been too careful for too long. He wasn't going to roll over that easily. "You're quiet, George," McCain said, leaning back in his chair. His voice was neutral, casual, like he was making small talk. "Most men in your shoes would be pleading their case right about now." Walker tilted his head slightly, his lips twitching almost imperceptibly into something that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Pleading?" His voice was soft, polite even. "Not much to plead about, Sheriff. I don't know what you think I've done." McCain smirked, shaking his head as he pulled a manila folder from the table. He opened it slowly, deliberately, exposing the photographs inside. Pictures of the crime scenes, of the victims lying in their staged poses. He slid them across the table toward Walker. "Funny thing about these," McCain said, tapping one of the photos with his finger. "You remember where we found Sarah Blythe, don't you? That empty warehouse out past the old mill? This one here was Heather Campbell out in Stokes Woods." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "See, I look at these, George, and I don't just see crime scenes. I see messages, something personal. Thought maybe you'd like to explain them to me." Walker's eyes dropped to the photos, his expression unchanged. "They're not personal to me," he said after a moment, his voice so calm it made McCain's blood run cold. "They're just your problem now, Sheriff." The trove of evidence. While McCain pressed Walker for any slip in his story, his deputies were back at Walker's apartment, combing through every square inch of the place. In its dimly lit corners and peeling wallpaper, they uncovered what amounted to a grotesque treasure trove of evidence. The closet, for instance, held more than just faded shirts and dusty shoes. Behind a false panel in the back wall they found a small box containing personal items Walker had taken from his victims, necklaces, earrings, even a worn leather diary that belonged to Emma Carlisle. Each item was carefully wrapped in tissue paper, as if they were cherished mementos. "Jesus!" Deputy Andy Malone muttered as he rifled through the box, holding up a delicate silver bracelet. "This guy's been keeping trophies." In the kitchen, Deputy Ryan Fletcher stumbled upon a pile of photographs tucked under a loose floorboard. Each one featured Walker's victims, caught in unguarded moments as they went about their lives. walking to work, shopping for groceries, sitting on their porches. The photos had been taken from a distance, as if Walker had been stalking them for weeks, maybe months, before striking. "Look at this," Fletcher called out, spreading the photographs on the counter for Malone to see. "He's been watching them, studying them." Malone's jaw tightened as he stared at the images. "He wasn't just killing them," he said quietly. "He was obsessed with them." The DNA bombshell. The breakthrough came late that evening when the Birmingham Crime Lab called with their final confirmation. Walker's DNA matched samples taken from multiple crime scenes, including fibers found on Sarah Blythe and Heather Campbell. It was the final nail in the coffin, the evidence McCain needed to tie Walker directly to the murders. McCain placed the call to the district attorney within minutes. "We've got him," he said simply, barely able to hide the exhaustion in his voice. "This son of a bitch isn't slipping through our fingers, not this time." The confession that broke Coldwater. But McCain wasn't satisfied with the DNA or the trophies. He wanted a confession. He wanted to hear Walker admit what he'd done, to say out loud that he was the one who had terrorized Coldwater for all these years. Walker's mask finally cracked that night during an interrogation that lasted well into the early hours of the morning. McCain's calm persistence wore him down, piece by piece, until Walker finally leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "You want me to say it? To admit it?" Walker's voice was low, almost a whisper. "Fine. Yeah, I did it. All of it. Every one of them. 11 women. McCain's pen froze over his notebook as the words sank in. "Why, George?" he asked, his voice steady despite the anger boiling under the surface. "Why'd you do it?" Walker's hollow eyes met McCain's for the first time that night. "Because I could," he said simply. "Because it made me feel alive, powerful." Those words hung in the air like poison, and McCain knew he'd never forget them. The town's redemption and scars. By the time George Walker was officially charged with the murders, Coldwater began to exhale for the first time in 5 long years. The town could finally see an end to the nightmare, but the scars left behind would take far longer to heal. Families of the victims gathered outside the courthouse during Walker's arraignment, clutching photos of their loved ones with tears streaming down their cheeks. McCain watched from a distance, leaning against his patrol car with his arms crossed. He couldn't take any pride in the moment. Justice was being served, sure, but it didn't bring those women back. All it did was stop the bleeding. "Sick bastard thought he could get away with it forever," Malone said, stepping up beside him. McCain nodded, tipping the brim of his hat slightly. "They always do," he said quietly, "until they don't." With George Walker behind bars and Coldwater finally free of its shadow, Sheriff Roy McCain hoped the town might find peace again. But he knew better than most. Evil like that doesn't just disappear. It lingers long after the monster is gone. The confession of George H. Walker. It started as a waiting game. George H. Walker had been in custody for almost 2 days when Sheriff Roy McCain decided it was time to push harder. They had the DNA evidence, the trophies found in his apartment, and witnesses who had seen him near the scenes of his crimes. On paper, it was an airtight case. But this wasn't just about the evidence. For McCain, it was personal. He wasn't satisfied with cold clinical lab reports or courtroom arguments. He wanted to hear it. He wanted George to say the words. The interrogation room. The room was stark, the kind of place built to make a man uncomfortable. A single hanging light threw harsh shadows on George Walker's face, but he didn't seem bothered. He sat calmly at the steel table, hands resting in his lap, staring at nothing in particular. His expression was blank, like he wasn't even present. McCain walked in, his boots clicking against the linoleum, holding a cup of black coffee in one hand and a folder in the other. He set both down with a deliberate thud and eased into the chair across from George. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy with unspoken truths. "You've been quiet, George," McCain said, keeping his tone steady but firm. "Most people don't handle sitting in here so well. But you don't seem rattled." George looked up, his eyes dull but unwavering. "Should I be rattled, Sheriff? I haven't done anything wrong." His voice was soft, almost mocking in its calmness. McCain smirked, shaking his head slightly. "That's funny. Real funny." He opened the folder and pulled out a black and white photo of Sarah Blythe's crime scene, sliding it across the table. "You remember her? Sarah Blythe? Bright smile, worked at the diner. Everyone loved her, George. Did you love her too?" George glanced at the photo briefly, his face completely unreadable. "You must have liked her," McCain continued, leaning forward. "You cared enough to position her just so, to make her look perfect. Why is that, George? Why'd you do it?" "I didn't do anything. George replied, his voice barely above a whisper. McCain leaned back, folding his arms across his chest. See, that's where you're wrong. We've got your DNA on 2 of the victims. 2, George. That's 2 more than you want to explain away. The cracks begin to show. George didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be weighing something, his fingers lightly drumming on the table. McCain waited, letting the silence stretch out like a taut wire. Finally, George spoke. DNA, he said softly as if testing the word. It's a funny thing, isn't it? You find a piece of hair, and suddenly you think you've got all the answers. We've got more than that, McCain shot back. He grabbed the photo of Heather Campbell's crime scene and slammed it onto the table next to Sarah Blythe's. You didn't just kill them, George, you posed them. Deliberate, precise. You know what that tells me? It wasn't just about the killing, you wanted us to look, to see what you'd done. George looked at the photos again, this time just a beat too long before averting his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. You wouldn't get it, he finally said, his voice low and distant. Then explain it, McCain pushed, his voice hardening. Help me get it. 11 women, George. Tell me why. The breaking point. The word sat heavy in the air. 11. McCain saw it. The slight twitch in George's jaw, the tightening of his fingers against the edge of the table. He'd struck a nerve. George chuckled under his breath, a sound so small it was almost inaudible. You want me to say it out loud, don't you? McCain leaned closer, his tone unrelenting. I want you to own it. Tell me their names. Tell me what you did to them. You've been hiding behind this act for years, George, but we see you now. We know who you are. George's smile faded, leaving his face as empty as before. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back at McCain. I did it, he said finally, his voice flat but clear. Every one of them, 11 women. The words hit the room like a gunshot. McCain's grip on his notepad tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He let George keep talking, giving him all the rope he needed. I didn't pick them, George continued, his gaze fixed somewhere far away. They picked me. They were there, living their little lives, walking around like they mattered. But they didn't. Not until I found them. Not until I made them mine. McCain's jaw clenched. Sarah Blythe, Heather Campbell, Emma Carlisle. They were more alive in their little fingers than you'll ever be. What gave you the right to take that away? George met McCain's gaze, and for the first time the hollow emptiness in his eyes was replaced with something else. Pride. Because I could, he said simply. Because they couldn't stop me. Because it made me feel... He paused, searching for the word. Alive. The weight of truth. McCain didn't respond, he couldn't. It wasn't just the confession, it was the ease with which George said it, as if he were recounting a mundane chore. 11 lives reduced to a man's desperate grasp for power. You think you're alive? McCain said finally, his voice razor-thin. You're not alive, George. You're just waiting to be buried. George didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, his job done. He'd confessed, but McCain knew it wasn't out of remorse. There wasn't a shred of guilt in him. The confession was a performance, one final act to remind McCain, and himself, that he had been in control all along. As McCain walked out of the room, he paused by the two-way mirror where his deputies stood watching. Malone looked at him, his face pale. You got him to say it, Malone said, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, McCain said, his voice heavy. But it doesn't make it better. A monster unmasked outside the precinct, news of the confession spread. Families of the victims gathered in silence, their hope for justice tinged with the searing pain of loss that would never truly leave them. Coldwater could finally put a name and face to the nightmare, but it came at a cost. McCain stood outside the station, staring out into the quiet street. The weight of the case pressed down on him like a stone. He admitted it, Malone said, coming to stand beside him. Yeah, McCain muttered, taking a long drag of his cigarette. But we already knew, didn't we? All he did was say out loud what we've been living with for 5 years. George H. Walker was formally charged with the murders of 11 women, his chilling confession marking the end of a nightmare that had gripped Coldwater for too long. But for the families of his victims and for the town itself, the scars would linger, silent reminders of the monster who had walked among them. What did you think of the tone? Should we dive deeper into McCain's internal struggle, or expand more on George's character? Let me know. The scars left behind. The arrest of George H. Walker didn't heal Coldwater, it simply gave the town permission to breathe again. For 5 long years the community had suffocated under the weight of dread, peeking out from behind drawn curtains, locking doors that used to remain wide open. Now the monster had a name, a face, and a confession. But the damage he had caused left Coldwater permanently fractured. The aftermath of a nightmare. For the families of his 11 victims, there was no such thing as closure. The word felt cheap, too neat for the jagged, broken pieces of their lives. They gathered in the courthouse during Walker's arraignment, clutching photographs of their daughters, sisters, and wives. The moment Walker walked in, handcuffed and flanked by deputies, the air in the room thickened. Nancy Carlisle, Emma's mother, stared at him from the front row. Her hands gripped the edge of the wooden bench so tightly that her knuckles went white. "I wondered if he'd look human," she muttered under her breath, tears streaming down her face. "He doesn't. He looks dead inside." Beside her, Heather Campbell's older brother Josh clenched his fists, his jaw trembling with restrained fury. "All these years," he whispered bitterly. "All these damn years, and we didn't even see him coming." Sheriff McCain stood at the back of the room, his hat in his hands, watching the families. He had learned years ago that there was nothing he could say to ease their pain. No apology, no reassurance, and no conviction could bring their loved ones back. The best he could offer was the truth. Walker was no longer free to hurt anyone else. "Justice doesn't bring peace," McCain muttered quietly to Deputy Andy Malone later that day as they stepped out into the fading afternoon light. The courthouse loomed behind them, casting long shadows across the lawn. "Then what's the point?" Malone asked, his voice tinged with frustration. McCain sighed deeply, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his words. "The point is, it stops with him. A town changed forever." Coldwater wasn't the same town it had been before Walker's killing spree. Neighbors who once greeted each other with easy smiles now avoided eye contact. The friendly banter of the local diner was replaced with hushed conversations about where everything went wrong. The church pews stayed full every Sunday, but the prayers were different now. People prayed for safety, for strength, and for forgiveness, though they didn't know where to direct that forgiveness. Walker? Themselves? The town? "It's like something broke in all of us," Reverend Carter said to McCain one morning after service. The two men stood near the church steps, watching families shuffle toward their cars. "We look the same, but it's like we're hollow now." McCain nodded silently. He felt it too, the emptiness that lingered in the air. Coldwater used to feel alive, buzzing with small-town charm. Now it felt like a town waiting for the other shoe to drop, as if Walker had carved his evil into its very soil. "Do you think we'll ever get past it?" the Reverend asked. McCain shrugged. "One day, maybe, but not right now." An uneasy pause for every family that lost someone to Walker. Their lives became defined by before and after. Nancy Carlisle spent her nights flipping through old photo albums, lingering on pictures of Emma as a baby, as a teenager, as a young woman with her whole life ahead of her. "He took that from her," Nancy would whisper to the empty house. "He took everything she could have been." Other families left Coldwater, unable to bear the weight of its memories. Some packed up and moved only a few towns over, hoping that a new street, a new house, would somehow dull the ache. Others went farther, disappearing entirely. But no one really escaped. Whether they stayed or left, the scars Walker had left on their lives remained. Small comforts, lasting wounds. For McCain, there was no moment of triumph in the arrest or conviction. He returned to his usual routine, drinking coffee at his desk, poring over reports, driving the same dusty roads he'd driven for 20 years. His deputies went back to breaking up bar fights and ticketing speeders. In many ways things looked normal. But they weren't. The corner of McCain's office was still filled with boxes, crime scene photos, witness statements, forensic reports. He couldn't bring himself to pack it away just yet. Every so often he'd catch himself staring at Sarah Blythe's picture, or the diagram of Heather Campbell's crime scene. He kept replaying the interrogation in his mind, Walker's calm, prideful confession. "Because I could," the man had said, like it explained everything. Malone found him sitting at his desk late one evening, the glow of the desk lamp casting shadows across the cluttered room. "You can put it away, you know," Malone said, gesturing toward the stacks of papers. "He's locked up. It's over." McCain shook his head. "For us, maybe, but not for them." He gestured toward the wall where photos of the 11 victims were pinned in a makeshift memorial. "They'll carry it forever," he continued, his voice heavy. "Every birthday, every holiday, every damn time they set the table and there's one less chair, it's never over for them." A town moving forward. As months turned into years, Coldwater began to stitch itself back together, but the seams were visible. Life went on, but it went on differently. People locked their doors at night. Parents didn't let their children play in the yard without supervision. A new hardware store opened on Main Street and its best-selling items, deadbolts and motion detector lights. They called it the Walker Effect. It was the unspoken but ever-present legacy of what George Walker had done. His violence had changed the town down to its foundation, shaping it into something colder, more suspicious. Few people talked about Walker openly anymore. His name was a ghost that drifted through the town, occasionally surfacing in stories told in hushed voices at bars, or whispered to newcomers who didn't understand why no one stayed out after dark. A sheriff's warning. 10 years after Walker's conviction, McCain stood on the edge of retirement. The weight of Coldwater, of everything it had been through, was etched into the lines on his face. On his last night as sheriff, he walked into the diner, the place where Sarah Blythe had once worked, and ordered his coffee black, just like he had every morning for 20 years. As he sipped, he leaned toward the young officer sitting across from him. Deputy Tomlinson had just turned 23, full of ambition and excitement, ready to take on the job McCain was leaving behind. "You think this job's about keeping the peace," McCain said, his hands cradling the coffee cup. "And most days it is, but every now and then you'll see evil for what it is, plain and unrelenting. When you do, you stop it. No matter what it costs you, no matter how long it takes, you stop it." Tomlinson nodded, but the weight of McCain's words lingered. The scars of Coldwater would never forget George Walker. Not the lives he took, not the fear he sowed, not the scars he left behind. The town moved forward, but it carried those scars proudly, a testament to the people who had survived what should have been impossible to endure. For McCain, it wasn't about forgetting. It was about making sure that no one ever had to hurt like that again. Some scars fade, others remain forever. Coldwater carried both. What do you think? Should we explore more of the individual families or McCain's final reflections on the case? A town's dark dream. Even with George H. Walker behind bars, Coldwater wasn't the same town it used to be. For 5 years, his twisted crimes had turned every street corner, every backyard, and every kind face into a potential danger. The soft glow of porch lights and the gentle chime of church bells couldn't wipe away the sense of dread that had seeped into the community. The killer was gone, but his shadow lingered. A town forever changed. It didn't take much to see how deeply George Walker's reign of terror had reshaped Coldwater. Drive down Main Street and you'd find houses that once had open doors and windows now lined with iron locks and drawn blinds. Children no longer played outside until the fireflies came out. Memories of carefree barbecues and neighborhood gatherings had faded, replaced with the silence of people retreating into their homes. Sheriff Roy McCain had seen the weight of that fear firsthand. He could see it every time he drove through town. People's faces weren't the same anymore. "It's not just the families of the victims," he had told Deputy Andy Malone one late night as they drove through the eerie quiet of what used to be a lively downtown Coldwater. "It's everyone. Nobody trusts anybody anymore." Malone, slouched in his seat, rubbed his hands together. "Can you blame him? Walker spent years walking around like any other guy. Could have been your neighbor, could have been the guy fixing your roof or the dude sharing a cigarette with you behind the diner. You learn to live with a monster hiding in plain sight and you start looking for him everywhere, even after he's gone." McCain nodded, his hands tight on the steering wheel. "Yeah, but this town, it won't ever shake him off completely. It's like he's burned into it, like a stain that won't wash out." The dreams of a boxer down by Fields Avenue, Reverend Carter ran a nightly grief group at First Baptist Church. He called it the Circle, though there was nothing particularly circular about the way people sat, closer to a haphazard clump of folding chairs arranged in the church's basement. Most of the attendees were victims' families, but over the years, people from the larger community had begun showing up too, carrying their own invisible wounds. It was during one of these meetings that Nancy Carlisle, mother of Emma Carlisle, spoke about her dreams. "I see her," Nancy said softly, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled tissue. "In my dreams. All the time. It's like she's still here, you know? Sitting at the breakfast table, laughing like she always did. I wake up just for a second and think it's real, but then it's not. I wake up completely and she's gone again." Josh Campbell, Heather's older brother, nodded beside her, his own voice low and edged in a raw kind of anger. "I dream about Walker, about what I'd do to him if I had 5 goddamn minutes alone with that piece of shit." He clenched his fists, his knuckles white against his denim jeans. "But then I wake up and I'm more useless than I was before." Reverend Carter stepped forward, his kind face lined with exhaustion. "Dreams are where our minds go hunting, hunting for peace, hunting for explanation. There's no shame in what you dream, but They don't always have answers. Sometimes dreams don't mean what we want them to. Nancy's voice cracked as she whispered, "Then what's the point, Reverend? What's the point of all of this if it doesn't mean anything?" Carter didn't answer right away. He just knelt in front of her, placing his hand gently over hers. "The point," he said softly, "is to keep going. One step, one day at a time. The dreams may not give meaning, but this town still can. You still can." McCain's quiet guilt. Across town, Roy McCain sat in his truck outside the police station. The windows were down, and the air was thick with the sticky smell of summer. Inside, the station was quieter than usual, his deputies working night shifts that mostly revolved around petty disputes or the occasional drunk driver. Everything was normal. But McCain couldn't bring himself to rest. He pulled a battered photograph out of his shirt pocket, running his thumb over the edges. It was from a town picnic years ago, long before Walker's shadow had crept over Coldwater. Kids with grass-stained knees ran across the town square. Neighbors laughed together over plastic plates piled high with burgers and coleslaw. McCain himself stood off to the side in his uniform, a younger version of him leaning against the tailgate of his truck with an easy smile. "It'll never be this way again," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The passenger door opened and Malone slid into the seat next to him uninvited, a styrofoam cup of coffee in each hand. "You talking to ghosts again, Sheriff?" McCain chuckled dryly, taking one of the cups. "Maybe I am." Malone sipped his coffee. "Town's quieter now. You ought to be happy about that." "Quiet ain't the same as safe," McCain said, staring ahead into the dark. "And people like Walker, they don't just disappear. Sure, he's locked up. Sure, he can't hurt anyone else. But what he did, what he put in people's heads, that doesn't go away." "You carrying the whole town's guilt now, Roy?" Malone asked, half joking but with a sharp undertone. "You did your job. You stopped him." "I didn't stop him fast enough," McCain snapped, the edge in his voice slicing through the night. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face before softening. "Sorry. Didn't mean to bite, but you're wrong, Andy. I didn't stop him, not really. I only stopped his body. He's still here, in the streets, in their houses, in their bedrooms when people can't sleep at night." Malone didn't reply, just sat in silence next to the older man as the sounds of cicadas filled the gaps in their conversation. The next generation years passed, and Coldwater began to rebuild itself in small, reluctant steps. A new mayor was sworn in. Young families who had never heard of George Walker moved in from larger cities, drawn by affordable homes and the promise of a quiet life. The town square got a fresh coat of paint. A farmer's market started in the summers, but even then the scars were still visible. At the local elementary school, parents still kept their children within eyesight. Streets were lit up like football stadiums at night, every driveway and front yard outfitted with motion sensors and security cameras. Trust was something Coldwater had to relearn, one careful interaction at a time. Sheriff Roy McCain retired quietly in the early 2000s. His replacement, a young officer named Tomlinson, cleaned out the old files one afternoon and found McCain's personal notebook from the Walker case. Flipping through the weathered pages, Tomlinson stopped at the final entry. McCain's handwriting was rough and slanted, but the words cut clean. "They say time heals everything, but scars heal slow on bad wounds, and this town's wounds, hell, they go right down to the bone. I did my job. I caught the man, but Coldwater bled and no amount of justice can refill what got drained out. All folks can do is keep living, one step at a time. But me, I'll always have this weight, the weight of what happened here. Maybe that's the cost of chasing shadows." Evil's residue. Coldwater didn't forget George Walker. They couldn't, no matter how much time passed. His name became folklore, drifting through campfire stories and barroom whispers. For those that lived through it, though, his memory was no story. It was a scar, but even scars, with time, begin to fade. Some townspeople called it resilience, others called it survival. Whatever it was, Coldwater endured. Does this expansion capture the tone you're seeking, or should we weave in more about the psychological toll on specific townsfolk? Let me know.